Have you ever actually stopped to think about where the everyday phrases we use come from? We toss idioms around all the time without a second thought. We use them in casual conversation, type them into our group chats, read them in the news. But almost everything we say has a beginning, a distinct moment of creation.
Look at these. Let there be light. The powers that be. Fight the good fight. We hear these constantly, right? Well, they weren't cooked up by some committee of modern linguists in a cozy university office. No, they were all given to us by one single guy. And to give us these words, literally inventing the phrases that completely shape how we communicate today, he had to live his life as a hunted fugitive.
Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're diving into the incredibly true high-stakes story of William Tyndale, the fugitive scholar who gave the English language the Bible. We're going to explore exactly how a 16th century scholar became an intellectual outlaw, risking absolutely everything, his freedom, his safety, and ultimately his life, just for the sake of the written word. Section 1. The Radical Ploughboy Promise. So born around 1494 near Gloucester, England, Tyndale wasn't just your average student. The guy was a linguistic prodigy. He gets this exceptional education at both Oxford and Cambridge, right as the ideas of the Protestant Reformation are starting to spread across Europe like wildfire, challenging centuries of established authority. And it's during these intense academic years that Tyndale completely immerses himself in his studies and just absolutely masters classical languages.
But to really get why these incredible language skills eventually turned him into an outlaw, we have to look at the strictly controlled world he was living in. Back then, the Bible was entirely locked away in the Latin Vulgate. And because it was exclusively in Latin, it was completely inaccessible to your everyday person. The text was fiercely guarded by the highly educated elite and church authorities, and they held a strict monopoly on its interpretation. Tyndale, though, he had this radical vision. He wanted the scriptures translated into ordinary English, making them accessible to absolutely everyone, from the local baker to the blacksmith. But here's the catch. Translating the Bible into the common tongue without explicit official approval was strictly forbidden. It was considered heresy. And heresy? That was a crime punishable by death.
So Tyndale didn't just want to translate a book. He wanted to democratize knowledge in a way that had literally never been done before. In one famous, pretty heated argument with a religious scholar who basically insisted people should just rely on church authorities and the Pope's laws, Tyndale shot back with a statement that became the defining mission of his whole life. He boldly stated, "If God spare my life, ere many years I will cause a boy that driveth the plough shall know more of the Scripture than thou dost." I mean, what a breathtakingly audacious promise. He made it his lifelong mission to completely bypass the elite and bring the text directly to the ordinary working person.
Section 2. Smuggling the word. Obviously, church authorities flatly refused his translation project, which backed Tyndale into a corner. He had a choice: give up his life's mission or go rogue. In 1524, he chose the latter. He left England, knowing full well he'd probably never be able to return home. He became a fugitive, crossing the English Channel and hiding out in cities all across Germany and the Netherlands. He was constantly on the move, dodging spies and bounty hunters, always looking over his shoulder to avoid arrest. And pulling off a massive covert translation and distribution network while on the run, that was completely unprecedented. First, he totally bypasses the existing Latin translations and works directly from the original Greek and Hebrew to ensure the most accurate translation possible. Then, working in total secrecy, he gets the text printed on underground presses. But printing them was honestly only half the battle, right? He still had to get them into England. So thousands of copies were smuggled across the channel, cleverly tucked into bales of cloth and buried deep inside sacks of grain and other everyday merchandise. It was incredibly high stakes. If a merchant was caught smuggling these texts, they faced severe punishment. But finally, those hidden copies were secretly distributed through underground networks, right into the hands of ordinary English speakers.
Naturally, church officials caught on to this massive influx of contraband literature pretty quickly, but their response actually led to one of the greatest ironies in literary history. The authorities were so desperate to stop the spread of Tyndale's work that they hatched a plan. They started buying up all the smuggled copies they could find just to publicly burn them in these massive bonfires. It was meant to be this terrifying show of absolute power, but they clearly didn't understand basic economics. The massive sums of money they spent buying those black market Bibles inadvertently poured right back into Tyndale's pockets, directly financing his next, even larger print runs. The establishment was literally and completely unknowingly funding the exact operation they were trying to destroy.
Section 3. Shaping the English language. Tyndale's operation wasn't just this logistical marvel of smuggling and evasion. It was a monumental linguistic achievement that would echo through the centuries, because he didn't just stop at translating the New Testament.
To really grasp the sheer scale of his genius, just look at his linguistic arsenal. The man mastered 8 different languages: English, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, German, French, Italian, and Spanish. 8 languages, completely self-taught or learned through intense academic rigor without any of the modern tools or dictionaries we have today. It was this absolute mastery that let him tackle major chunks of the Old Testament directly from the original Hebrew. He was the very first person to bring books like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Jonah into everyday English. And remember, English was still a developing, somewhat unrefined language at the time. So Tyndale often actually had to invent the phrasing and rhythm just to make ancient Hebrew concepts make sense to an English plowboy.
And to put his impact on how we speak today into perspective, check out this staggering statistic. Scholars estimate that between 80 to 90% of Tyndale's exact wording in the New Testament was kept in the King James Version, which was published decades later. His clear, elegant, and memorable English didn't just translate a religious text, it literally helped build the foundation of the modern English language itself. He crafted the cadence and the vocabulary that would go on to influence centuries of literature, and honestly, every English speaker that followed him.
Section 4. Betrayal and the Stake. Now, living life as a hunted outlaw eventually catches up with you. The stress, the constant moving around, the endless paranoia, it takes a brutal toll.
His downfall was rapid, and it was tragic. In 1535, a man named Henry VIII, who had deceitfully befriended Tyndale and totally gained his trust, betrayed him to the authorities near Antwerp. Tyndale was ambushed, captured, and thrown into the dark, freezing dungeons of Vilvoorde Castle. He sat in that prison for over a year, enduring miserable conditions, bitter cold, and failing health, all while just waiting for his inevitable sentence. Finally, on October 6, 1536, he was convicted of heresy. He paid the ultimate price for making the written word accessible. He was strangled by the executioner, and then his body was burned at the stake.
But even facing death, after enduring all that cold and condemnation, Tyndale never once abandoned his calling. According to tradition, as he was tied to the stake, his final, dying prayer was this loud, passionate plea for his homeland and the people he dedicated his entire life to serving. He cried out, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes."
Section 5. A Prayer Answered. And this brings us to the final resolution of our narrative, and truly the ultimate irony of William Tyndale's life. Because that dying prayer, it was answered almost immediately. Just a few short years after Tyndale was executed as a heretic by the establishment, the political winds shifted. The very monarch who had hunted him down and despised his work, King Henry VIII, officially authorized the publication of an English Bible.
That authorized version, known as the Great Bible, and later the famous King James Version, didn't start from scratch. The scholars commissioned by the king heavily relied on the monumental groundwork Tyndale had already laid. They built directly on Tyndale's forbidden translations. The very words that he was imprisoned, strangled, and burned alive for, writing, quietly became the absolute foundation for all major English Bibles read openly throughout the entire nation. His life was taken, but his words, they conquered an empire.
So the next time you toss around an idiom or read a common phrase without a second thought, remember the fugitive scholar. Remember the dark dungeons, the smuggled grain sacks, and the flames at Vilvoorde Castle. Just think, how much blood was spilled for the words you speak and read every single day?